Hi, folks. Welcome to Code and Concrete, where we share the latest trends and the stories of trailblazers in the built environment. I'm your host, Matthew Schneider, the CEO of Building Inc. Joining us today, we have two special guests. We have Gura Gladeau, who is the CMO at NationsFirst. She collaborates with Indigenous leaders to build finance and trade infrastructures that foster self-determination, wealth creation, and long-term sustainability for Indigenous nations. We also have Ethan Clark, a Coast Salish entrepreneur and CEO and co-founder of NationsFirst Technologies. He leads blockchain technology to advance Indigenous economies, unlocking economic and environmental value while enhancing resource management and investments. Thank you both for joining me today on the show.
Thank you for having us.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. We got connected a couple months back talking about how there's a real need in the Indigenous communities for transparency in land ownership, which is something that's been impeded on for hundreds of years. And I thought, wow, this is a really unique use case for the technology. You hear people talking about titles and deeds, but I think for the most part, a lot of people, especially in the US where we are, that's not a concern for them, right? It's like a first world problem, like, oh, maybe I'll put a title or deed on the blockchain if I have to, but it's not something that has been quintessential to a cultural identity. So I thought it was really cool. We had to get you on the show, and I know that you've been doing a lot with your product lately, NationsFirst, something that we'll dive into later how you're using the technology. But first, I want to unwrap how you two started to take the leap into entrepreneurship, decided we should do something about this problem. We need to be the people who develop a solution and drive change for our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'll go first, and then we'll see what Ethan's perspective. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think I've naturally been in the entrepreneurial space. I've grown up to be surrounded by creatives who, are spearheading initiatives around community. And I was really grateful to be a part of my father, who was, a community-centered man, and he always spearheaded the local community's initiatives, and whatever the case was in terms of economic development specifically. But when I got into this space, I always found myself doing the storytelling for other entrepreneurs. I got into marketing, and when I got into design, I realized that there's so much in terms of how do we design better sort of solutions in all aspects of Indigenous economies. And for me, thankfully, I worked closely with community-centered initiatives, especially in e-commerce as well, with other like-minded Indigenous entrepreneurs, and really just helping them in the startup phase. So I've had quite the experience working with many brands in their startup phases, really listening to their stories and how rich and in depth that our economy is. And we all share the same sort of narrative. And I think at the same time, there's very special pieces to where sort of, as Indigenous people, where do we often see barriers, but how beautiful it is at the same time that we are still here with resilience. And there's just so much excitement ahead in terms of Indigenous economics. So I'm very grateful to be able to, be spearheading this type of work. I took this role at NationsFirst. What it really just meant for me is that an opportunity to shape our public image, shifting narratives that have long been told for us, rather than by us. So, through storytelling and strategy, I hope to drive engagement and highlighting the ways that we as a company are actively creating change through technology. So, thankfully I met Ethan here back in November 2023. The topic of blockchain came up, and, of course, him and I being entrepreneurs, we started creating solutions, like ideating solutions. What could that look like, especially in the realm of finance? So it's been interesting sort of journey to learn about the barriers as Indigenous people within the finance space. And I'll leave that to Ethan to explain more because I think his perspective is really well told. And so, yeah.
Thank you, and yeah, thank you for having us here. So my sort of journey as an entrepreneur sort of started young. I was never good at listening to anybody or taking things the way they were. And the core sort of lesson that my father told me, and he is Indigenous political leader, kind of fighting for the officer of the treaty, the non-status populations. He always taught me to question everything and everything. He meant everything, right? Never take anything at its face value. And so when I started sort of going through school, never did so well. Tried to get jobs, never did so well, and ultimately, naturally, sort of ended up in this space where I was, building my own companies quite young, and with my friends, and we were always trying to figure out how do we build something innovative and. Took many forms, but ultimately, always was sort of one focus, and that was really innovation for Indigenous economic freedom, for, raising capital, allocating capital, and ultimately really self-governing. So, yeah, when Gura and I met, it was, we had some conversations around the resource industry, minerals, and all these sorts of, these trillion-dollar industries here in Canada that have had quite a poor effect on Indigenous peoples, and uh, you know, we really sort of rallied around the fact that these industries, these legacy industries, we could utilize this technology to leverage our community, leverage our rights, and leverage the capital that we do have to lead in these more influential industries, and sort of I guess lead the charge into the next growing industries like technology and blockchain and AI and these sorts of things.
That's very interesting. Let's sort of set the stage here. So, what do the traditional industry or cultural issues look like when we talk about indigenous economies and how they might not have had autonomy? What does that look like, and how can you start to introduce blockchain technology to reclaim some of that independence?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one that our communities don't actually ask enough of. And if I'm going to take it right back to sort of the beginning or the root cause of the issue, prior to colonialism, there was 63 nations here in so-called Canada. Upon the implementation of the Indian Act, those 63 nations were divided down to 619 band councils. So dividing these families, dividing these cultures, dividing all these intricate governance structures, hereditary systems and economic systems and trade routes and all these different things that got heavily divided. And so governance has long been a core issue that's that our people have been fed many alternatives to that ultimately were never meant to serve us. And so, we've been passed through the systems of the Indian Act governance and the Indian Act, the sort of general structures from chief and council systems and elected chief and council systems through, various special governance structures that are tailored to each First Nation. But the same system goes, you have to essentially sell your rights as a nation and as a people in order to even sit at the table and discuss or negotiate your own governance agreements. And so, ultimately, we see this as a potential for community-led governance. If we're talking about Indigenous governments, really restoring those traditional government structures and governance structures of nations, language groups that make up these nations, and dialects that make up those language groups, and clan systems and family systems, and all the separate sort of governance structures that make up each one of those, and make those and made those work for tens of thousands of years. But also, looking at sort of more modern problems today, things like resource developments, and the volatility these, of the Indian Act governance structure as it relates to economic development. We see we live in such a resource-driven economy here in Canada, and I think that, um, it's one that a lot of our people, really rely on and really, really value. But we have to remember that all of these developments are happening on one Indigenous territory or another, or overlapping. But even within First Nations territories, under the Indian Act, there's almost $2 trillion worth of these resources. And so there's immense potential for investment, but there is also huge risk as it comes to the volatility of these Indian Act governance structures that leaves these 2 to 4 year election cycles where, one elected leadership may support and the next may opt out when the community generally actually backs these projects. And so the community-led governance is something that we think will become a big adopter of the technology, but also advancing more legacy industries. I don't know if Gura has more to add onto this, but I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, in Canada, over 600,000 square kilometers, I believe, of Indigenous land like remain underutilized due to, bureaucratic constraints, if you will. So, we see a huge opportunity as to what are ways that we can tokenize, these lands as fractionalized assets, and how could we create new investment opportunities and channels that could improve the local economy. So, there's so many years we have been so caught in this this economic disparity of a cycle that, we have not been considered at the economic table for so long. So now there's conversations that are being had that will really drive economic, prosperity by integrating what are new, emerging technology that we could utilize as a means to, creating new channels. So it's just really exciting in the times that we live in, because now we are able to really consider what are those ways and how can we do it in, in the way that we can. It's given us a second chance at being able to generate that wealth. So yeah, very exciting stuff.
When you say some of these regions are underutilized, how so? What would it look like to utilize the resources efficiently, but also, I think, capture the value and ensure that it stays within the communities as opposed to probably the traditional deals where you have some sort of conglomerate that comes in, right, some sort of unfair contract and agreement, and then extracts those resources and moves on to the next. So how do we
Yeah.
utilize those better and structure it fairly?
I think that's a really great question. I think that this is like, I think the answer to this is something that's going to resonate really well within the tech space as well. In the mining sector, for example, you've got the main five, really three, you could even say two here in Canada, corporations, these multi-billion-dollar corporations, and they, any sort of mineral exploration project, any early stage project that comes up, does its exploration, does its testing, has gone through the permitting process. Realistically, 99% of them are not going to go in, and it's really, but ultimately they'll get acquired, and they'll get acquired by one of these larger sort of monopolized, um operating mining corporations. And so it's kind of, fools selling to bigger fools, and that's sort of the way the industry has been set up. And I think it's similar in many ways in the tech industry, right? There's a lot of these projects that are sort of, you look at like Google, for example. I mean, or any large corporation with a venture arm, and a research and development arm. Like 80% of those budgets go towards acquisitions. And 90% of those acquisitions, they just get rid of. They just throw it out the door, scrap it for parts and throw it out the door. And ultimately, there's in that case, there's technology there. There's real ideas, there's real innovation, there's real products and solutions being made. And similarly, within the resource space, there's real resources there. There's real minerals there. There's real biodiversity, real ecosystems, real life, right? That exists. And so what we've sort of bet our money on is tokenize those in-ground resources, tokenize those ecosystems. There's value everywhere. There's value in the drinking water and protecting drinking water. There's value in protecting biodiversity. There's value in generating carbon credits, and there's value in keeping the gold in ground, right? We can advance our economies. We can, while aligning that value with the well-being of our peoples, our communities, our environments, and all things around us, right? So I think this opens a door for our communities to start doing, non-invasive testing, drilling, and exploration in a way that we can start tokenizing these resources, tokenizing our ecosystems, attracting investment and reinvesting it back into our local economies, right? And I think that's not something just Indigenous people can do. We can do that everywhere. We can do that, other underserved populations can do it. I mean, it's happening everywhere. It really is. We're seeing it happen in South America, Latin America. We're seeing it happen in Africa. We're seeing it, and I think it's time that our people sort of catch up here.
Yeah, it's definitely a global phenomenon. Hero, is there something that you wanted to add? Okay.
No, I was just agreeing.
Okay, perfect. One thing that I wanted to pick up on was the tokenization portion of it. So there's a lot of different reasons to tokenize. And on here, we talk about transparency, operational efficiency, distribution of investment. When you talk about the tokenization of natural resources, either themselves as commodities or the businesses handling those, where do you see that tokenization is going to add the most value? And as as you develop Nations First, like what's your priority? What's your biggest or your flagship message for the technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this was a major thing that we have noticed is with the conversations that are being had at the forefront with like, at Indigenomics, with the resource management, industry, like, it's all about creating a circular economy, by prioritizing ways to engage within our community, as what are ways that we can tokenize even our art. Art's a huge factor within our economy that, it brings a lot of the local artists, and finances, their lives. And the thing about, Indigenous art is that it's often taken away from them. And, we don't get enough credit in terms of like where that art comes from and who is it by. So I think just the idea of like tokenizing and creating an NFT around that, I feel like there's so many use cases that could really support the economy of the local Indigenous artists. But there's so many ways that you can look at this, even just with real estate, especially what are ways that we can, create fractional investments towards land that could support the local economy as well. So there's just so much, avenues that we can consider that it will really help in terms of like building those bridges, especially with access to finance and to global investments and investors. And so it's definitely, what we have been working hard on is like, how can we create a token launch pad so that we can have or be the bridge to, Indigenous businesses and nations that are looking for those investments and for investors who are looking to, have meaningful impact to those businesses or nations, right? It's really just being the bridge to that, which really doesn't really exist. So token launch pads and being able to tokenize that allows for us to look at new ways to attract investment. So yeah, I'll pass it on to Ethan.
Yeah, I think, and totally, there's a lot of our people rely on very community-based at-home businesses. It is a huge portion of our economy is self-employed people. In fact, I believe one of the highest demographics of entrepreneurial people are in the Indigenous population, but it is a lot of these at-home businesses, right? These small businesses, these family businesses, and these sorts of things. I think there's a huge opportunity as well within the high growth sector, right? There's the technology space that our people are so underrepresented in. And I remember starting Nations First and going out and, we're trying to raise capital and it's like, we're trying to build a product and all these sorts of things, but it's like, you got to go raise friends and family and you cannot do that. Like I can't go to my community and try to go raise 20, 30, 50, 100 grand. It's not going to happen. Our people in our communities, like living off of, less than $1,000 a month, less than $400 a month in some instances, right? And even in my own community. And so there's a huge gap there in sort of that like pre-seed to seed stage venture and only 0.02 or less percent of VC money actually ends up deployed to Indigenous entrepreneurs here in Canada. Similar in New Zealand, less in the States, way, way less in Australia. And that's just hitting on the sort of for more developed countries with Indigenous populations. That's before you even look at, throughout the other 400 plus million Indigenous population around the world that's facing similar financial infrastructure issues. So one of the key areas that I see is really bridging that gap in early stage funding. That's a big part, I think, as well as real estate, right? Our people, there's a $500 billion infrastructure gap in Canada between the Indigenous population. Major part of that's housing. 40% of our homes are basically condemned. They're in unlivable conditions or they're overpacked and that's both on reserve and off reserve, right? One interesting statistic I always like to refer to is the fact that Indigenous peoples in Canada are ranked 73rd in quality of life globally compared to what, third or fifth or something for the broader Canadian population. And so it's almost like there isn't really another solution that exists in the market today. Tokenization really is that thing that bypasses a lot of the bureaucracy that has strategically been set to stop economic development and social development and environmental protection for our people. So, I mean, it's across the board. There's the technology has like, when we started, we are jumping from one use case to the next, to the next, to the next, till we're finally like focus, focus, focus. But it has so much potential across all portions of the market.
The red tape portion is really interesting. I found in the US, a lot of people wanted to use blockchain to bypass or navigate some of the red tape that exists. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, cracked down. And we realized that the technology was not going to add some of the flexibility. How is it in Canada dealing with the legislation there and the regulations? Does it differ depending on Indigenous community, or is the law overarching? So, umbrella formats, and how are you able to use the technology in a way that does cut through that red tape?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area. Like in the States, it's more clear out there. Obviously, they've been more sort of crypto and blockchain friendly, I think, than here in Canada has. The thing is here in Canada, like the securities are regulated provincially rather than federally, as is in the States. And so when you look at the Canadian system and specifically the Indian Act structure and the relationship in which First Nations have, when I say First Nation, I mean an Indian Act government, as well as the traditional nations, their relationships are not to the province. Their jurisdiction is not subject to the province. And in fact, when these laws are being created, of course, they weren't really thinking about securities and stuff like that. They were thinking about subsurface, anything from the ground below, right? timber rights, mineral rights, water rights, all these sorts of things, right? And so while you incorporate in Canada, you are, essentially, you know, governed by the crown. That creates a really interesting opportunity to utilize these decentralized autonomous organizations. Nations can actually issue those. First Nations can issue those. That is 100% within their right. It is 100% within their right to issue tokens. It is 100% within their right to issue membership and residency to govern all these aspects of their membership, their economies, and all sorts of things like that. So while the infrastructure is not, fully developed, the opportunity is there. Aboriginal title and rights has been protected over 270 times in the courts, in the Supreme Courts of Canada. So it's clear that our people have that opportunity to not only uplift our own communities through bringing in innovation, bringing in all this wealth and this talent, but also assert themselves as a player in the broader global economy and global markets, and in a way that like upholds their rights. Now interests are aligned with Aboriginal rights and title, right, from that global market. So it's a huge opportunity for our people to take. And I think that we're leading it. We're having a ton of conversations about it, and lots of I'm sure we'll be putting out some stuff around exactly what we're doing. But we had a legal opinion drafted. We're having it peer reviewed. We're going to be talking and are talking with some key industry players, in tech and industry advocates, and even, political leaders and First Nations leaders and Indigenous lawyers and everything. And it's, it's something that people want. It's something that's very, very viable. And I think needs to happen somewhere, right? It needs to happen somewhere for this industry to move forward.
Yeah, and to add to that, it's interesting that there's jurisdictions being pushed. I mean, they have already been implemented elsewhere, like Dubai, creating the internet city, and these as like these all these frameworks have been implemented and put into practice. So it's like what can we do that we could take the best parts of those things, all while maintaining regulatory opinion and having legal opinion on that. But it's such an interesting topic because it really does strike to a lot of the leaders that we've been speaking to, because they have been looking for an alternative. Yes, they have been speaking and talking and having all these conferences that they attend to create change, but nothing has been done, and it's been so long, right? But the moment that we bring in, economic free zone and tokenization and blockchain, it really does perk the ears of these leaders, and it's interesting. So, given that we do have very special inherent rights, we have the opportunity to really tap into this unrealized potential of being an economic or providing economic free zone opinions and stuff like that, so that these frameworks can be implemented and adopted. So yeah, there's definitely some interesting talks that we're having. And I think there's a lot of tech companies that could also be able to experience and be a part of this partnership with Indigenous communities that can implement this. There's so much ways that we can bring back talent to Canada. And although, we are losing the Web3 space because of the stringent conditions that are being applied, and is not providing them any incentive to stay here. So what can we do to adopt more of that economic, potential back into Canada? So I feel that Canada is quite behind on these things. And, we have local leaders that are in a sense of urgency as to how we can really move in tandem with the rest of the world in this emerging market, if you will. So yeah, that to say.
I want to hear about some of these conversations that you're having and some of the change that you're implementing. But first, I want to hear the story of how we got here. So, how has the vision changed over time, if it has at all? What's it been like building a startup in Canada using blockchain technology? What changes were needed, and where are you at today? What can we, what's the big stuff happening?
Yeah, so we've always kind of stayed along the same mission and vision and that sort of thing, and it's generally stayed the same in that way. But the tactics that we've used and just the platform has made some changes over time, right? And when we started, we were focused really on banking the underbanked, but not financial inclusivity. Like I'm not looking to get everybody entangled in this broken financial system that we have here in Canada and the States. Like that's, I don't want that. What we wanted to do was really create a more sovereign and more enhanced sort of financial infrastructure that not only addresses those issues of the underbanked and the unbanked, because 50% of our people are unbanked or underbanked here in Canada. That's 500 million a year it's costing our population in excess fees due to whatever their sort of other channels are using, and in the States it's much worse. We're looking to empower people, right? Have sound money, have a financial market and capital markets that really work for you. And so that's always been the mission. And there's always been, we've slowly started integrating more on the governance aspect of things and the communal finance side of things. And that's sort of the shift that we've had. But ultimately the big change was, focusing on working with the community to get their resources tokenized and put on chain. And so that way they're super leveraged and they can unlock a ton of value. And that works for us and that works for them. And that makes us, a high value player in the blockchain space. And that makes them a high value player in the resource space. Right. And so that's sort of been, there's been many sort of, little things in between, but that's sort of the high level pivots that we've taken, I'd say.
I would say so many blockchain companies are pivoting all the time. I mean, from whether it's provenance, which is something that we were talking about or came to mind when you talk about art. Where did it come from? Who's handled it? How did it get here? And you could apply that to so many different types of items that have value or contracts to look for spoofs or originality and to be able to trace that. Some companies are focusing on that now, and they weren't before. Then there's circular economy. You hear that more and more. How can we reuse items, and how can blockchain empower that? In fact, I'm heading to London soon to talk about circular construction technology and then fractionalization. So you just see all these different use cases that come and go throughout the cycles. What's popular in crypto, and now people are talking about RWAs and DePIN. So it seems like it's sort of our time to thrive for us tokenizing. There's been so much infrastructure that was lacking. Now it's here, and companies like us get to be in the spotlight and actually bring forward use cases that are legitimate and serve people, as opposed to some sort of coin that's really just masquerading someone's will to rug other people and make a bunch of money.
And I think another big part of it is like in our space are people like Indigenous folks, they don't trust tech. They don't trust big companies. They don't there's a lot of mistrust, and rightfully so. And so that's been a key sort of thing that we've had to move around. And even just, besides the public opinion, the actual infrastructure that was developed. I mean, there's all these like Indigenous entrepreneurial support programs out there, and you go to them and they're like, nope, we don't deal in tech. We don't deal in tech. We don't deal in tech. And so it's like, where do you go? Because you go to the VCs and they're like, sorry, Indigenous market doesn't exist. And then you go to your own people and they're like, no, we don't deal with tech. And so it's like, who do you go to? Right. And I think that's where we just had to get, really sort of scrappy and innovative and sort of build our own table. But and I think that probably the broader blockchain space can sort of feel that way where, and especially maybe even in the RWA space, it's like there's not, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of focus in the space internally in the blockchain space on these crypto projects and these really a lot of these meaningless things.
Yeah, I guess it's also just, how do you stay within like the safe sort of framework, and I feel like there's a lot of fear that comes to technology from, even with Indigenous people. But, the thing is, and I always say this, is that, if we don't, you know, um, keep up to date with our hard drive, we're always updating ourselves. So, what makes it, what makes it important for us to, continue to learn and adapt to technology? What are ways that we can really utilize, and providing solutions, right? Are you still using, Rolodex and old bookkeeping, systems? And yet to this point, we still have a lot of, um, people that are just so upset around like the transparency thing. Where is money being allocated? Our chiefs are not being very transparent. Leadership is being questioned. And even then, if you bring in new like ideas and new projects and proposals, it's like it's immediately shut down because they're so comfortable in the way that the system is. So it's definitely interesting to be in this space because not only are we disrupting it, but we are also rustling some feathers that haven't been rustled in so long. um, but it means that things have to change. And a lot of our people are looking for that alternative and looking for things to, support, and especially if it means like that it could bring, avenues, like new avenues of wealth to our community. It's like immediately they are just put their wall up when even the term finance, and because a lot of our communities are financially illiterate, and as soon as they hear the word money or, finance or anything around that, it's like they immediately have this fear to it because the relationship that they have with wealth, it's not the same. It's like this coming from the scarcity mindset. Like we cannot, come in with these new ideas, and then now you got to think about the project, processing that and how much it's going to cost, and things like that gets lost in translation. So it's really about how can we support the process as well when it comes to resource management, financial management, and what are ways that we as a company are also, educating our people through that as well. And so we do have educational sort of arm to Nations First that we are actively, letting people know that we are also teaching the aspects of technology. What is a DAO? What is blockchain? Because it is important, and we do feel the huge gap missing there, where a lot of people are immediately fearful of technology and finance. So
That was
yeah.
something I wanted to touch on because you're fighting multiple battles here. And education is one way to win over people, just familiarizing them with the concepts, because you've got to talk about the technology in general, but then this is also a very specialized technology, blockchain data, artificial intelligence. It takes a bit of whiz to understand it. Then you go beyond that and you have the going against the status quo. And if you have figures of authority who are resisting the change because it's going to may perhaps incriminate them in some way, maybe funds were being misused or abused, and you've got that. And then cultural resistance, like financial literacy. You can talk about the technology, you can talk about changes to governance structure, but then you have to change how people think, how they go about their daily lives. What's sort of your strategy here? Education being one, but in just as a company also going to market and tackling each of these issues.
So we're at a we're at like a perfect time right now, right? There's this everybody talks about the sort of great wealth transfer, right? And the transfer of power and the transfer of authority and the transfer of money and the transfer of all these things, right? And our people are at that same point. The best thing is 50% of our population lives under the age of 35. And so this is like we're kind of at the starting point, just a bit ahead of the curve, I think, where we're starting to see a lot of these young leaders take leadership positions and become more innovative, and that are, they grew up with technology. They use things like, AI tools every day. They use digital marketing every day. They use digital media every day. Like these are all things that they've grown up with and they use. And so we're kind of where we're focused on as a business model is we don't need a lot of users, we don't need a lot of projects, we don't need a lot of resources to add a ton of value to a select few communities. And so we've been focusing on those nations that are more forward thinking, these investors that are more forward thinking, and working with them to bring their community on. And in time, and in the next few years, we'll keep seeing more and more and more young people take leadership positions and more young people, becoming entrepreneurial and becoming educated. And all the bad things that are happening within our community from every social economic data point, the one thing that our community is doing is they're becoming more educated, right? We're, and it's unfortunate because everything else is getting worse, but we're becoming more educated and we're younger and we're younger and we're younger. So, it's almost sort of the perfect time for a population that is looking for a solution that has been beaten down for so long, but is so young and so innovative and there to adopt, right? And build.
Yeah, and I guess to answer to that as well, like when we do work with our close partners, it's like what are ways that are we integrating ourselves into going into these communities and having the firsthand experience of their stories, and what are their pain points, what are ways that we could utilize our group, which holds capital, provides capital for the local entrepreneurs and the hub that they have in partnership with Google, which is so cool. And they're down in New Mexico, and we have a really good partnership with them where we're going to be going to their community directly, engage with the community and the entrepreneurs that they have there. They have an entrepreneur hub where they provide procurement and innovative like sort of foundation to enhance the experience of their needs and what they're looking to create in terms of solutions. So having to be immersed in that and see what can we do in terms of like a DAO, how can we better support these initiatives so that we are also thinking and experiencing and providing the the usability feedback that we can get from by being in these communities. So it really provides us the firsthand experience. So I think that's really about creating the incentive, in the relationship building aspect is really in going there to listen and going there to experience and see what they go through and what they have to offer.
And I think that's a core sort of piece of our strategy as well is the fact that there is a lot of handholding to be done. And that's not something that we're going to get around. There's a lot of education to be done. There's a lot of these things, but we've built a business model that works around it, that works for that handholding, for that trust building, for getting all these resources onto a network and these real use cases and all these sorts of things. But also at the same time, we get to really see the problems firsthand across all different sectors, right? Across, our first tokenization project was minerals. And it's like, you find out what you need and sort of the experience of working in this industry and actually being able to build on top of that rather than building something, finding out it doesn't work a year later and having to go back to the drawing board. It's like it's constant pivoting and real data driven and actual approach or sort of like real hands-on lived experience pivots, right? Which is really great.
Let's talk a little bit about the platform. How are you solving these problems? What does it look like if someone comes to Nations First? How do they, what can they expect in terms of product and service?
Absolutely. So, there's where we're focused again, it's a lot of hand holding. So we look at a longer sales cycle. We look at a lot of real, relationship building in those first months and first weeks where we're really understanding the business model, the assets, the community, all these sorts of things, the culture. And so it comes down to, looking at what assets are there, what community members are there, like, well, who are your rights holders? Who are your stakeholders? Who are your shareholders? Who are all these things? And what sort of governance structure do you need for that? What sort of assets do you need to tokenize? And so then, creating the governance structure through a DAO, simple as launching a DAO, totally modularized, but like we can tailor it to really anything, right? And then from there, actually tokenizing the assets, getting the users their wallets, getting them trained and onboarded into the platform. And then eventually, and this is sort of future roadmap stuff, but listing them in the marketplace and being able to start understanding, how to raise capital through secondary markets, right? And so that's sort of, in four simple steps. It's really, tokenize the asset, put it into the community or, the individual, raise the capital, and then participate in the governance.
So sort of like DAO as a service.
Yeah, it's like we have like DAO as a service, like token launch as a service, a sort of DAO as subscription, a whole sort of thing. So it's we're taking little pieces of all kinds of business models to make one sort of end-to-end solution.
It's essentially creating like a online circular economy of, different groups, right? That could be registered as nations, as businesses, as even small mom and pop shops, whatever the case is. A DAO is an entity that essentially will recognize them as a group on our platform. So we're really trying to at a high level imagine what a online digital economy would look like, but it's on a network, right? It's really just incentivizing the 100 billion dollar economy that, Indigenomics has been, emphasizing as a narrative, because it is true. There's a lot of Indigenous, self-funded local businesses, infrastructures and resource projects, but are looking for a platform or alternative as a means to circulate that wealth and to create, a space that they can tokenize and, create, the incentive of, investments and stuff like that. So it's really just providing a network, of tools they can utilize. So that's just where we're at. We are, we have built a DAO, platform. You can go on the web page, create a DAO yourself, whether that be for your team. You have a company, you go create a DAO, you set the parameters around that DAO and that governance. You create project proposals in there and you get, membership votes on that, whether that passes or not. It really creates that consensus, for those projects. And, even just working on implementing a treasury dashboard into that so that they can tokenize, their project, put it on the token launchpad that we are building so that they can then have more, investments coming in, and that goes directly to the DAO, populating, that DAO pool, the finance pool. So there's just like the opportunity is really just to provide that platforms for these businesses to come on and create an entity so that they could feel like they are trusted. Data sovereignty is so important. So whatever information that they're uploading, it belongs to them, and they only have access. They have full ownership to that. So it's really just providing a safe space, but also, again, really empowering that autonomy that we have long been needing. So
I love that. I love that. Do you have any like noteworthy partnerships or projects that you can share, or are things sort of still incognito in the beginning?
Yeah, we have one that we're kind of going out and marketing right now, which is the Spirit Rock Resources Network. We essentially launched a sub network on our chain, and essentially built a decentralized autonomous organization for them. So their community is, currently it's the people within the mining company and the advisors and the Indigenous people around. It's an Indigenous owned company, which is really great. But what we're, and essentially they have like over, I believe it's 30,000 different sorts of points of data around biodiversity, around, their ecosystem, the gold, the copper in ground, all these sorts of things. And so in time, and this is coming up, we'll be actually tokenizing those assets. and then integrating the local First Nations into the governance of the assets. And so they can own the rights of the asset, but investors can invest into the upside of the asset. And so it just creates a lot more security for the community to engage in the resource markets, but it also creates a lot more security for the investors to know that there is stable and community-backed governance within a territory that really has done so much. Like that, in that territory, they've done so much for Indigenous rights in the resource industry. You cannot make anything happen without the community approval first. And so it's been the perfect sort of sandbox for really testing out this side of things. And we're looking at others, currently in like in the energy sector and even like the decentralized physical infrastructure for transmission lines and battery storage facilities and all sorts of stuff like that, as well as like general ecosystem conservation where people can invest into the ecosystem and it generates carbon credits and drinking water credits and all these sorts of things that are actually monetized and return capital while they get to essentially invest into the protection of an ecosystem. So and then all sorts of other stuff that we're looking at, like outside of Canada, there's tribal nations across the world that we're sort of talking to as well, and a lot of these groups are sort of looking at looking at the technologies. So it's obviously it's been happening. Lots of them were early in like crypto mining and Bitcoin mining and stuff like that. So, they're looking at AI, they're looking at emerging tech. But, we're looking at some really exciting use cases right now. Some we've onboarded, some we're onboarding, but it's all like everyone we look at is super exciting. It's always great.
Yeah, we also have a partnership with Cereblo Technologies on the education piece, because, even with our partners, they're very excited about blockchain. It's like, ooh, but then like when it gets to the technical pieces to it, it's like that's where all the questions start to come up. And I think that's where, this education front is so important because it is all about like how can we, utilize and what is the tutorial around using this new platform because people are new to it. And, so it's like, how are we educating and creating that incentive for people to get excited about blockchain? So that's also another front that we also partnered on. So.
For all of these items, is there anything major in 2025 that you want to get done, that you think you'll get done? What does the roadmap look like for
Oh,
education and
absolutely.
product and company and all of the above?
Real estate, my friend. I want to talk to you. I want to get into real estate. There's some really exciting opportunities happening right now, and there's a huge gap to be filled. And that's, whether we fit it into our 2025 roadmap, unlikely. I really want to start looking at it and doing the research on it. And, that it's such a huge opportunity. There's such a need for it. But ultimately, I think this year will really prove out within the Indigenous economy that this technology is a solution, and that it'll really start to build that credibility and that trust within the community. And it is a small community, right? Word travels fast in our communities, right? And we're using that to our advantage for sure. And then, other things, it's just really like the course, like we want to push it out. We're offering it free for Indigenous communities. So we want to see a lot of our people, doing that. It's online as well. So, they don't have to go in person and just, really start building the education around it. That's something I'm excited to see happen this year. And then, there's some other stuff around the regulatory stuff that I mentioned. I won't share too much right now, but I'm hoping to put out some really exciting papers, I guess, and sort of announcements this year that I think can really put our people at the forefront of this industry and will be, I think, big news within the Indigenous community and hopefully the broader tech community.
Yeah, yeah. And to add to that, it's 2025 is looking so interesting. And it's because, the uncertainty that's happening, people are really discussing what the next thing is. We even see a shift in the local economy with the whole tariff thing. It really
It's a
just
great
got
point.
right. So it's like, what are we doing to support our local economy? Now we really got to consider, the sovereignty piece aspect, especially, with my nation, they have their own community garden. When we speak about economic development at these conferences, we really should consider like what are ways that we are actually working within our own local economy to create, to create wealth and even through, food sovereignty. And so I think it definitely shook some, people's feathers as to like, oh, coming into the fear state again because they're not prepared. And I think that's why having these conversations are so important now because, with recessions and inflation comes, then we have like, all these different things that we don't realize we should be paying attention to. And so the tariff, there's huge opportunity in terms of how Indigenous nations can really utilize, regulatory frameworks that could promote that and to create, you know, bylaws and stuff around that will help both nations, nations as in, well, the nation state, Canada and the US and the nations within and things like that. So it's, yeah, we have a lot of great conversations going on. 2025 and 2026 is going to look very interesting. But yeah.
Code and Concrete has now entered diplomatic relations. Sometimes I forget about the tariff war that's going on. It's like too hard to keep up with. It's on, it's off. We're lifting them. Someone's retaliating, and I know that there's been a lot of talks from individual provinces that are saying, "Fine, we're not going to give you any products, America," But nonetheless, conversations like these persist, and we can talk about the silver linings and the opportunities and really what matters at the end of the day, not the politics, but the people. We're trying to empower our communities. We're endorsing progress and innovation. We want to bring education and just find, I mean, because we're really living through it. You can't expect people at the top echelon to say, "Oh yeah, let's roll out a new technology to make things more equitable." No. It needs to be people on the front lines who are saying, "I'm dealing with this problem every single day, and it's not being resolved. I'm going to put up a fight, and we're going to bring forward this solution." And that's exactly what I want this platform as a podcast to offer to people.
Yeah, it's been amazing here to share what we've been doing. I think a lot of people are catching on now. We've had so much interest in the past few months, just it's amping up because I think people have already been aware that Indigenous people do have special like rights, but they just never understand to what extent what that means. But I think when it comes to like if it could help the local economy as well as the Canadian economy, then what does that look like? I think now people are willing to listen. So it's been an interesting trajectory.
I want people to have a call to action here. I'm going to have links to your LinkedIn, social medias, and website, of course, in the show notes for that course that you mentioned. Is that available on your site?
It is.
Yeah.
Well, it will be. We have a partner site currently, and we can share that as well.
Mhm.
I believe it's Sarabloh, sarabloh.com/education.
We'll have the link in the description,
I'll add it.
for people to be able
And
to click through that.
we welcome any Indigenous people for free. It is paid for non-Indigenous folks, but it's such a great course. And there's real career opportunities. We've, partnered with even like Solana and their Canada super team. And so there's career opportunities that follows and we're building a ton of partnerships around it. And then, we're looking for support. Like I'm sure any and everybody who's built in the blockchain space has probably had some frustration with the regulatory frameworks, whether that be in Canada, whether that be in the United States, whether that's often anywhere really, right? There's a lot of gray areas, and that's not a good thing. And for But as was highlighted in like the Native American Harvard project, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous governance are going to be the ones to solve and capitalize off of these regulatory gray areas. So we want to hear what problems people are facing and how we can sort of frame this regulatory sandbox to really address these key issues. So I'd welcome anybody to shoot us a message and LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter. Our DMs are open, our email is open, and just start the conversation.
Absolutely. I
At
encourage people to do that.
nationsfirst.io. You can find us at nationsfirst.io. Yeah. But yeah, I'm really happy to thank you so much yet again. It's an honor to be here and looking forward to our conversation as well.
Of course. I mean, it's been such a great conversation discussing this. I think it's a unique topic. We talk about innovation, real estate, but there's that intersection with culture as well and identity, and it's really important. And I think it's underutilized in blockchain, which is all about sovereignty and autonomy. So using that to the best of its abilities. I really thank you both for this great conversation and watching the growth of Nations First throughout 2025.
Thank you. And thanks for having us, and thanks for all the work you do. I think it's really great. I think it's really interesting work, and I totally let's catch up soon and let's talk about it, because I got a few opportunities and ideas I want to throw around that we're working on. I think that this is really the space, and especially, you guys are in this space and set up, and real estate is the next big thing. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be decentralized. It needs to be made accessible. So, thank you to the work you're doing as well, and thanks for having us here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that briefly. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners who have joined us on another episode. Please consider following and leaving a 5-star rating on whatever platform that you listen to. Until next time, then.